Muy buenas tardes a todos. Agradecemos nuevamente su presencia en el último bloque de conferencias dentro del cuarto Congreso del Hábitat y Sustentabilidad de los posgrados del Departamento del Hábitat y Desarrollo Urbano del ITESO. La palabra sustentabilidad se ha convertido en las últimas décadas en un concepto básico que forma parte de la toma de decisiones, que se utiliza para la generación de nuevas soluciones, se plantea para la protección y conservación del hábitat. Sin embargo, a pesar de que está presente en nuestros discursos y en nuestros ideales, nuestras prácticas cotidianas, los modos de producción y la manera en la que nos desarrollamos en el día a día no necesariamente están alineados. La necesidad de innovación permanente, la corta vida útil de la gran parte de los objetos que utilizamos, la búsqueda de mayor seguridad y confort, así como el alto costo de vida dificultan que las prácticas sean mucho más sustentables o que permitan construir hábitat más sustentable. Esta tarde exploraremos el futuro de la sustentabilidad. Aprovecharemos para no detenernos más en los problemas, conflictos y riesgos, sino pensar en las oportunidades, las alternativas y las respuestas. Tenemos una oportunidad de hacer una valoración crítica a las soluciones del mercado, al oportunismo político, a la industria, pero también es la oportunidad de pensar, como nos decían hoy en la mañana, en la esperanza, en la posibilidad de cambiar y de transformar. De poder ver una visión colectiva que reconoce la voz de la justicia y de la solidaridad. Sin más, daremos principio a este primer panel en esta tarde y a partir de ahora la presentación será en inglés. Nuestros conferencistas están conectados desde Sydney en Australia y en Roma. Por lo tanto, estamos también dando la bienvenida a aquellos que están conectados a través de YouTube en transmisión simultánea. Muy buenas tardes. Paul, James, and Gianfranco, thank you very much for this connection. We're talking about future of sustainability, and you're definitely in the future because you're ahead of our time. Thank you for connecting in this at this time, at this moment. I'm going to introduce you to our audience in Spanish. I'm going to read your CVs, and we will start this conversation. Les presento al Dr. Paul James y al Dr. Gianfranco Franz. El Dr. Paul James es autor y editor de más de 30 libros, incluyendo Globalization Matters, Engaging the Global in Unsettled Times, publicado por Cambridge University Press con Manfred Steger. También escribió Urban Sustainability in Theory and Practice, que publicó Routledge en el 2015. Ha sido asesor de varias agencias y gobiernos, incluido el proceso canadiense del G40, la Comisión para la Acogida, la Verdad y la Reconciliación en Timor Oriental y ministro de Desarrollo Comunitario en Papúa Nueva Guinea. De 2007 a 2014 fue director del programa de ciudades del Pacto Mundial en Naciones Unidas y actualmente es asesor científico de la Cancillería del Senado de Berlín sobre sostenibilidad. Gianfranco Franz es arquitecto y urbanista, catedrático de Políticas para la Sostenibilidad y el Desarrollo Local de la Universidad de Ferrara en Italia. En 2012 fundó la Red Universitaria Internacional Rutas hacia la Sostenibilidad con 9 universidades en 5 continentes y sumando actualmente 23. En el 2022 publicó el libro L'Umanità a un bivio, il dilemma della sostenibilità a 30 anni da Rio de Janeiro, que ha sido presentado en más de 25 ciudades y universidades italianas. Nos da mucho gusto poder tener esta participación a distancia y vamos a dar inicio. Paul, Gianfranco, thank you for your time. It's a very simple question. We thought this panel to start with the question, what is the future of sustainability? So I will ask Paul to tell us a little bit about what he has been working on and what he would like to share with our audience today. This is your microphone. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Emma. It's a great honor to be here. The question of what is the future of sustainability, I want to approach by talking about not the future as such, but how to think about the future, because I think there's too much of a tendency within futurism to project future possibilities as if we know what's going to happen. And a lot of that depends upon what we do now. So in talking about that future, I want to focus on the nature of the future of sustainability, not talking about the alternatives or possibilities, but rather how we should be thinking about those questions. And I'm going to focus on three things: what is happening to the world, what is the future of the planet, and what is the future of sustainability practice. So again, I apologize for speaking in English rather than in a language which is more central to the conference, but I'm going to hopefully make myself reasonably clear. I want to think about the question of what's happening to the world and do so through the kinds of themes that have come up in the conference. So here in the conference, there's been an emphasis on trying to look at the parts of this crisis that we face, and words like commitment and activity and hope, or critique and pragmatism, have been part of the process, trying to think how you can have both sides of that question, both deep critique, but also pragmatism, because we need to work on how we work with others to do this. So the first section of what I'm going to address is what is happening to this world. And I want to say one thing very simply and precisely: the world is in utter crisis. There's nothing you can say more than that. It's in utter crisis. It is in manifold, comprehensive, overwhelming crisis. I don't need to spell it out for you. And the question about it is, for this thinking about the future, for all our technical and analytical knowledge, we humans still do not know collectively how to respond to it. So those qualifications to our vast knowledge are quite important. The first one is the compounding effects of our impact on the planet remain completely unclear. We're still in the dark. So, for example, yesterday we learned that with ocean warming, we're finding ourselves with the warmest ocean temperature in recorded history, and we don't know why. That simple point suggests that we're actually in a triple crisis mode. It's a crisis of knowledge, it's a crisis of not knowing about the meaning of the knowledge we have, but it's also a crisis about the connection, the compounding effects of our impact on this planet. The second point is much of the world, despite the urgency of forums like the one we're in, much of the world is willing to defer, to put off, to delay, or even to argue against the sort of changes that we need. They suggest, for example, the market will take care of it, or technological change will provide solutions. And as soon as they do, what they are doing is delaying our responses. And the third point is that the manifold and interconnected nature of the challenges we face remain elusive, because we're not just talking about ecological issues, we're talking about a crisis which is political, which is economic, which is ecological, and which is cultural, and particularly the cultural and political issues, but the cultural ones in particular get left out completely. So if you take, say, circular economy as an example, it gives the impression of an integrated system, but mostly it's just business with a different rhetoric. Mostly it's just a more sustainable supply chain with some but limited consequences for mitigating waste. And that issue, which is quite critical, means that, yes, we all should be working on things like circular economy, but we shouldn't put our emphasis on thinking that is the answer, because it's only one small part of the answer. And we need to know the breadth of the crisis and its causes. And we look to those causes like, yes, of course, capitalism is rampant and its dominance need to be taken in as central to any explanation of the current human condition. But that's not enough. And yes, the designation of the Anthropocene names the fact of consequentialist human impact on the planet, but that's not enough. Most of the Anthropocene discussions barely broach the ontological nature of that impact upon the constitutive consequences of that impact upon the human condition. We talk about we're having an impact upon the planet and we debate where it's coming from, but we don't actually recognize that there's massive changes occurring to the world, the ontological nature of that impact upon the constitutive consequences of that impact upon the human condition. We talk about we're having an impact upon the planet and we debate where it's coming from, but we don't actually recognize that there's massive changes occurring to the world. So I'm getting feedback again, completely. It's overwhelming. Sorry. Thanks. And then the other one is the great acceleration, which will give us all the facts and figures.
Sorry about that, Paul. We did not realize that you were listening to both.
So I'm getting feedback again. Thanks. So it illustrates how resource use and damage to the planet is dramatically increasing, but it doesn't actually show what the nature of the crisis is. We can put all those statistically derived figures alongside each other, and you've seen the graphs. The use of paper and water and fertilizer and fossil fuels is just going up exponentially. It's salutary and it's compelling, but for all of its importance, this graphic dashboard stops at the point of economic ecological diagnosis. And in those terms, the ecological crisis has drawn all the attention to itself. In fact, really, it's not even the ecological crisis, it's the climate crisis which has drawn all the attention to itself. So we need to recognize the importance of the climate crisis. Absolutely. The climate crisis is a paramount and major thing, but so is the extinction crisis. So is the ocean acidification crisis. So is the crisis of people's cultural meaning. So is the crisis of the way in which we live in this world and are destroying it and think that we're acting well, or at least acting in ways which will mitigate. So we've begun to talk about the climate change as an existential crisis, but we also need to face up to the fact that we as humanity face an existential crisis. What does it mean to be human? How do we relate to each other? And I think these are bound up with each other. So in summary, what I would suggest is that this manifold crisis of the human planetary condition means we need to focus on things which are not just measurable trends and trajectories, but also qualitative changes. And the alternatives needed for this mutual human and planetary flourishing will be much more than just stopping carbon use. They'll be dealing with things which are about our abstraction from the planet, our reconstitution of the nature of the planet. That is, we are materially abstracting social life. We're fundamentally remaking relations between people and between persons and our world. And we're also reconstituting the nature of nature. We're using technoscience to remake nature, and we're barely talking about it. We're unsettling the deepest structures of human practice and meaning in a way that's changing the nature of our social meaning. So our social being is one of those things which I want to talk about. Let's talk about then that second point, the question of the great unsettling, the future of the planet. What's actually happening here? Well, yes, we're destroying it. We're ripping it apart and all those things in that sort of material sense of the world. But we're also, and this is an important point, we're also changing the nature of nature. And as we do, we're changing our understanding of what nature is. And this is happening through a process called technoscience. Technoscience is that application of abstracted high-tech science into the world, and it's reconstituting the building blocks of nature. It's changing how we think about it, and it's occurring both in the sciences and in the social sciences. So the dominant paradigm of intellectual knowledge across the early 20th century to the present has been to change the standpoint from which we know the world. That world is becoming increasingly relativized. In science, it's very obvious. We have uncertainty principles. We go into looking at atoms and subatomic particles and so on. Uncertainty, excuse me, has been built into the foundations of quantum mechanics, but it's also happening in the social sciences. We're now talking about the end of nature. The nature is not ending, it's being changed. And all the words, and Bill McKibben's a good example of this because he asks for a humbler way of engaging with nature, but he calls his book The End of Nature, as if it's a social construction to be managed, reconstructed and remastered, and which opens the way to things like geoengineering. And in the ecological sciences, we're seeing the same thing happening. We're talking now about ecosystem services, as if nature is this rationalized object of resource management. Nature is losing its category as being a meaningful category of social life. And this also connects with the social sciences in a way which we're seeing all sorts of different groups of people, from the new materialists to the post-humanists, trying to treat nature as just another flat ontological frame for which humans are operating within, and they're diminishing humans in that process. So this leads me to the final issue of what happens, what is the future of sustainability practice? Well, in one way, it's completely obvious what we should do. We need to consume less, we need to live simpler lives, at one level, and these are really important issues, and they're so simple, they're unbelievable, and yet we cannot do them. We find it very hard to consume less, live simpler lives. We've known for 30 years about climate change, and the world is actually consuming more than it was. We have consumed more in the last 30 years than we consumed in the whole of human history. Now, there's an irony. At the point that we know we need to live simpler lives and consume less, we're actually making it worse. It's become worse since we have known. And the other part of it is we need to re-engage with others and with nature in a less mediated way, less technologically driven way. We need to live much less technologically driven lives. And so, yes, we'll need things like Zoom to connect us across the planet because we want to have these kinds of dialogue and conversations. And we don't always want to be moving across the planet in jets to talk to each other. But we also need to think about our lives in places where we live with others in close association, thinking about developing ethical frameworks for thinking about the nature of our lives and what we're going to do about living on this planet. So there is a series of options there, and I'll outline 3 options around this. The option 1 is the amelioration of current practices. So cutting back, trying to make things simpler, all those things. And there tends to be an emphasis on what we can do personally. And this remains important. There's no doubt about it. In fact, I'm going to suggest that all these options have to be happening at the same time. In this amelioration option, it'll be pragmatic. It'll be trying to do what we can. It'll be acting as an engaged intellectual to work on this crisis of the planet. But option 2, which I think also needs to happen, which is acting critically in the world against the kinds of emphases at the moment which are around business as usual, but with a different rhetoric. And the first one is direct action and people going to the street. Now, I think that's very important. I think that there's the Extinction Rebellion movement, and there's various other groups who are doing direct action. And there's even groups who are describing violence against property as a necessity. There's been the movement to set up things like throwing tomato juice at Van Gogh paintings, or alternatively slashing the tires of all the SUV vehicles in a particular town in a Scandinavian country. And I think of Andreas Malm's book, How to Blow Up a Pipeline. Now, I'm not myself, I'm not personally in favor of that. I'm actually much more of going to the streets and thinking about it as a direct action where you set up with communities and others to do things which make a difference. But all of those options have to be on the table. They have to be different people will make decisions about this. And the third option I want to talk about, which I spend a lot of time thinking about, is a principles-based transitional practice. And what I mean by that is that we need to think about what are the principles for living with others, for living in and of nature, for living close to the places that we are engaged with, for the places and place-based activities we engage with others to make a difference. And as we develop those principles with others, we think about it as a transitional practice. And this has guided my particular way of thinking about it. If we want to exist on this planet, we have to do now what we think is the way of living properly. Geoengineering has been put forward as a possibility. We are now returning with the Greens of various countries in the world, like particularly in Germany at the moment, the Greens Party is thinking about nuclear energy as being important. If nuclear energy is not part of our future, we should not be using it now. A transitional practice, if we don't believe that blowing out pipelines is the way to the future, is what we'll do in the future, then we shouldn't be doing it now. So this transitional practice argument is one that suggests that the way of life that we develop means that our intellectual practice, our engagement, all the work that you're doing as students and academics and as scholars and as practitioners needs to be directed towards what kind of life you think the future will hold. And in that future, we need to start living that life now because we haven't got much time. It's that kind of world I want to talk about. It's that kind of politics that I want to emphasize. So to summarize what I've been saying, we are in a crisis. This crisis is so comprehensive that we don't know how to deal with the comprehensiveness of it. We're in a crisis where even the scientific parts of that crisis are still beyond our understanding, but we do understand exactly what to do about it. And therefore we should start doing those things now. And they are two layers. The first layer is living simply, more simply, consuming less. Simple point. But the second layer, which is a cultural political layer, is living less mediated lives, living less abstract, drawn away lives, living less technologically framed lives, living lives with others where we make decisions together about the lives we want to live. Thank you.
Gianfranco, you can start.
Hola.
Gianji, where you're starting now. So it's,
Yes.
it's impossible. Yeah.
Okay.
So for you, over to you. Yeah.
Thank you, Paul. So, good afternoon to everybody. Let me thank some friends because it is an honor to be invited for the second time to this ITESO conference. I wish to thank Dr. Emma Morales, who is here with us, and Dr. Monica Solorzano, Dr. Raul Diaz-Padilla, and for this invitation. And I want to thank also and congratulate Dr. Sara Obregon-Davis, the Dean of the Hábitat Department. I met her in 2016 when we were invited as Roots, as the network, the Roots Towards Sustainability networks, to take part to the first Hábitat conference in ITESO. And finally, let me thank my great friend, Dr. Daniel Sardo, with whom I have shared years of work and research in Italy, Japan, Brazil, Chile, Argentina, Easter Island, etc. And so thank you to all these colleagues. And the question is really a challenge. What is the future of sustainability? And it should be interesting also to ask what is the future without sustainability. This is another good question. And the problem is that we have to speak about future, but in terms of sustainability, the future is now, and indeed the future was yesterday. This is one of the problem because we have not been able to meet sustainability in the last 50 years. Climate change, in fact, comes from afar. In the 70s of the last century, the climate began to warm up, but very few people cared about it. Many people started to work on this problem, and I call these people the beautiful, as Paul James knows, I call these people the beautiful minds of the ecological crisis. Our ecological crisis is not the ecological crisis of nature. And for the youngest people who are participating in this conference today, I want just briefly to mention a few names, because it is important to not forget, especially in this historical period of human knowledge, characterized by the production of tens of thousands of scientific papers, often useless. and especially tomorrow with the arrival of artificial intelligence, which will allow to us to produce hundreds of thousands of other scientific papers, and probably often useless. I was saying that it's important not to forget some names. Which names? Edgar Morin, for instance, the still living French philosopher, or Aurelio Peccei, the Italian manager, founder of the Club of Rome in 1970, and Donella Meadows, her husband, and other colleagues who wrote at MIT in Boston the very famous report for the first United Nations Conference on the Environment in Stockholm, organized in 1972. This book is entitled The Limits to Growth, and this word is very important. In a few minutes, I will return on this word. And then Gregory Bateson, the British psychologist who wrote in the same year, 1972, a great book. I suggest the youngest, the students and the younger researchers to read Steps to an Ecology of Mind. And the last two, very common, the biologists who from the New York University began to speak about circularity with this famous book, The Closing Circle. This is the title, The Closing Circle, and Nature, Man, and Technology. And this book was edited in, published in 1971. Please note that we are still in this problem, the closing circle, nature, man, and technology. And finally, but only because we must speak about future and future of sustainability, I wish to remember the great Ernst Friedrich Schumacher, the great economist who fled to Great Britain during the Nazis. He was from Germany, and he escaped in Great Britain, in the United Kingdom, becoming professor at Oxford. Schumacher, in 1973, wrote a small book entitled Small is Beautiful, Economics as if People Mattered, which is considered one of the 100 most influential books written after World War II. And this is important because I will quote Schumacher at the end of my short speech. These people were talking to us about the ecological crisis and the ongoing climate change, but only a few listened to them. And today we have to face a dramatic and dangerous climate crisis because we do not want to face, and because we are unable to face the cultural roots of our ecological crisis. Paul was speaking about political, social, economical, and cultural roots of this ecological crisis. And the cultural, I think that the cultural roots, the cultural bias is at the base of this crisis. And therefore, we continue to believe that our marvelous technological innovations will solve all the problems we are creating. But this is a great illusion. If we really want to move towards the ecological transition to sustainability, we should forget, I think, the 20th century and some of its main ideological and cultural assumptions. In fact, if those cultural assumptions have led us to the planetary ecological crisis we are experiencing, we cannot solve it with the same cultural and mental tools. The problem is that mental tools are an ineliminable part of our species, Homo sapiens. We cannot totally modify our brain and modify the brain of all the humans. And our brain is, by its nature, unsustainable, predatory, and violent. For this reason, we have to work on other war fronts, especially two fronts. The first one, we are too many. At the beginning of the 20th century, there were just over 1.5 billion humans on the planet. In 2050, on the same planet, there will be more than 9 billion of humans. Too much, too many for our exhausted planet. Also because our increase will reduce the number and quantity of all other living species, plants and animals. And we are speaking about biodiversity. This is biodiversity. If we will be 9 billion in a few years, few decades, of course, the other species will lose their space in the planet, in the nature. And the second one is that we should forget, but really we must forget the concept of growth, even the fake concept of green growth. Growth and, of course, green growth are one of the cultural and ideological pillars of the 20th century. We have confused development, which is a natural dynamic, with material growth and the growing consumption of goods. Material growth, which is a Western dogma during the last 2 centuries, has become hegemonic due to globalization during the last 30 years. As Paul told us a few minutes ago, we consumed more resources and goods and everything in these last 30 years than in the history of the human beings. And this is our problem. But it is very difficult to break free from the mental slavery of material growth. For the youngest guys, I'm quoting the great Jamaican singer and poet Bob Marley, the mental slavery. This is really a chain. And it is a big challenge. And the fascinating concept of the growth is still too weak, in my opinion, and too intellectualistic. So we must work to free ourselves, to emancipate from many contaminating concepts, more dangerous than the many viruses that are killing us. And these concepts are speed, efficiency, productivity, competitiveness. These are really bad words, contaminating words. The idea to innovate, to go faster, with cars always bigger and bigger, trains faster and faster, airplanes, etc. To go higher with buildings, with skyscrapers and rockets. And now we have also space tourists. That is crazy. To go deeper with the drills to extract more oil, gas, gold, and minerals. And this idea that we have to innovate to build bigger and bigger, the absurd building in Saudi Arabia, they call the line, and they are building this building, telling us that it's sustainable. This is really a fake idea. Or building enormous cruise ships and absurd ocean transships to move grapes and avocados also from Australia, Chile, and Mexico to the rich European markets, or to move plastic products from China all over the globe. And this is we have to change this system, but to be able to change the system, we have to change our mind. We have to free, to emancipate our mind from this concept. As I told, speed, competitiveness, growth, and productivity, etc. To achieve the ecological transition, and here I'm quoting Ernst Friedrich Schumacher, we need to change our culture, our way of thinking and living, by re-emphasizing a principle our ancestors knew very well. We need to understand when enough is enough. Learning newly when enough is truly the greatest challenge facing humans of the 21st century. We need poets and singers for a 21st century redemption song, and quoting once again Bob Marley. Thank you very much. A 21st century redemption song, and quoting once again Bob Marley. Thank you very much.
Okay, sorry about the technical problems. Can you hear me now without the echo?
We can certainly hear you.
Yes.
No?
No more.
Is it all right now? Can you hear me? Sorry about that.
We can
Yes.
certainly hear you. Yes,
Okay,
we can hear you,
so,
but we can also, about 10
okay.
seconds later, we hear our own feedback.
Mute myself. No? Yes?
So if we move into a dialogue, you'd be happy with that? I would ask
Yes.
Gianji some questions and talk about next. Later, we hear our own feedback.
Okay, it's the distance then. I will read all of the questions and
So
then...
if we move into a dialogue, you'd be happy with that? I would ask Gianji some questions and talk about next.
Perfect. So all the questions in one, and then we will have one speaking first, and then it will be the other, and we'll close the session.
Sure.
Okay. So this is for Paul James, but I think it works also for Gianfranco, is how can we begin to live better together and make decisions together amid such stark power asymmetries? Is there any hopeful examples that we can build upon? That's the first question. The second question is what is to be gained by calling it a crisis? Will we get fatigue from talking about crisis? The third one is about how everyone in the audience is in some degree a technocrat. So there's a training, we have a training and outlook. How can we use this and still be humble? Like, how do we use this knowledge, or how do we build simpler lives through this knowledge? And the last question is about how in Mexico, when you present a project aiming to improve with environmental protection aims, it passes through a financial director, and then it gets refused or rejected. So they are aiming for a favorable investment rate of return. How to convince them? How to make them understand that this also has value? Thinking what Gianfranco was saying, these concepts of efficiency, competitiveness, innovation, how to bring projects to these gatekeepers that are stopping these projects from moving on. So this person, he does large-scale composting. So these are the four questions, very, very different, but I would like to have just one participation by Paul, then one by Gianfranco. I think we are left here with
So maybe if I start, because
Yes.
it's an issue. The technology issue is a very difficult one, and it shows how important technology has become in our lives, of course. And the first question, which was a crucial question, how can we begin to live better together against such powerful forces? And I think Gianfranco has made what I think is a really basic point. That is, we need to get out of the mental slavery that we find ourselves in. And Bob Marley's quote there is quite important. there is still, and these are the cultural roots of our crisis that we need to take account of. We can begin to live better together by changing the way in which we aspire to be important in this world. And that is the way in which we try and think about our impact upon the world has to work at many levels at the same time. One of the ways in which, say, the organizational social movements of the 1990s talked about it was think globally, act locally. Well, we cannot do it quite like that. We have to rethink everything from the local to the global. And so in effect, there is the dimensions of what you're doing as you live locally, and you can de-link yourselves from many of those powerful processes that are being talked about. You can de-link yourselves from the kinds of careerism, money orientation, the sense of status as being important, and you can do that fairly carefully and pragmatically in such ways as you don't destroy your life. Now, that is a concern and it's a problem, but it's something that we can do because that working with other people, local communities, or with, in the cases of us as technologically and intellectually trained people, everybody in this room, as one of the questions says, we're all technocrats. We are all people who know enough about this situation to think about it. And we can then link it to the question of that which was asked in the question, how do we still be humble? Well, let me talk about that. And I'll just use Gregory Bateson as an example, because he's one of the beautiful minds. He's a person who makes an enormous difference to thinking about the ways in which we should think about science, human condition, and nature. But also at the same time, we have to remember that these beautiful minds had their own weaknesses, just as we have our own weaknesses. He was a person who was involved in a series of conferences on cybernetics in the 1950s. And this conference on cybernetics, which included people like Norbert Wiener and Claude Shannon, they went on to establish the science of cybernetics. And people like Bateson were actually in favor of this science of cybernetics. And that is also part of our problem. They were trying to unsettle the distinction between humans as knowing natural beings and computerized machines as programmed, unthinking entities. And they were really the first people who were starting to think about the meaning of artificial intelligence and so on. And I would put artificial intelligence with one of these powerful forces, which is changing our lives and is part of the crisis that we're in. So I would suggest that in thinking about the cultural roots of our crisis and how we can live together better, we need to do that getting out of the mental slavery that Gianfranco was talking about, and material growth, speed, efficiency, innovation, productivity. And one of those terms is the term called the economy. If you know history, you will know that the term, the idea of a thing called the economy, a reified object which has power in the world called the economy, occurred in the 20th century for the first time. Marx didn't use it, Weber didn't use it, even Adam Smith didn't use the term the economy. The economy is now framing our mental lives. We need to break out of that, and we need to think about what economic activities are. They are simply managing resources. They are no more than that. They don't have forces beyond that, except as human beings do things with it. And I'm not dismissing those powerful forces that were being talked about. I'm really saying that we enact those powerful forces through our own actions most of the time by giving credibility to a thing called the economy as if it's got life in and of itself. So what is to be gained? And this is the second question from calling it a crisis. Because if we don't name it as such, and we just call it, there's a problem with this and that, if we just say that there's these issues to be responded to, they'll be responded to in singular ways. And I use the circular economy as a good example of that. We have a crisis which is across the planet, which includes a crisis of the way in which we consume and the way in which we produce goods, which is producing too much waste. Now, what the circular economy does at its best is say, you actually should consume less. But what it does at its worst is say, well, you can consume what you like as long as we design those products well, so we can collect them and put them into recycling and then take them through a cycle as if there is wealth to be gained from making a mess of this planet. And the worst of circular economies simply do that. They actually set up the conditions for excusing more growth, more innovation, more change, which is about consuming more. And so when anybody says to you, as an intellectually trained person, this is the answer, be really careful of them, including, of course, what Gianfranco and I are saying, of course, because there is no singular answer. It is about working with others to think about what those answers might be. So I think what is to be gained from calling it a crisis is that we need to talk about it as a manifold crisis rather than simply a climate crisis or an ecological crisis, because it's a crisis of the human condition. Now, if we're all technocrats, how can we use this and still be humble? We have to. We have to use our technical knowledge, but also think about what the meaning of our technological knowledge is. Now, I'm in favor of people doing work on technological systems to solve our crisis, but there are certain kinds of technological systems which are going to make so big a change. And I think the kinds of geoengineering is one of those. I think the kinds of processes which, for example, they sound banal and they sound like they're not making too much of a difference. In Australia, we have a problem with what's called the Great Barrier Reef. It's the massive reef system, which is the most magnificent reef system of the oceans of the world. And there are scientists in Australia who are working on genetically manipulating the polyps of coral so they can live in 2 degrees warming. That's not the answer to the world's problems. That's not even the answer to saving the reef. That's the answer to destroying the planet by controlling it scientifically. And so there are certain kinds of science which are about the reconstitution of nature, the recombination of what it is to be inside the world and inside nature, which I think we should be reconsidering. And that's not as simple as it sounds, because there are certain things which go to the edge of that, but we need to be thinking as technically trained persons all the time about what our material activities are doing, what our intellectual life is making a difference to, and how we are changing the planet. Now, in Mexico, when you present a project, it goes through this financial matrix, which or financial sieve, which will make a difference to what it is. I think we need to be working at all those levels at the same time, as I said from the beginning. Namely, you have to work within a world which takes the economy as the framework for thinking about what is the good, and in doing so, present it in the most comprehensive way. But do not take yourself as doing a good job for the planet as you do that. You're doing a pragmatic job to get that project up and running, which will do good for the planet. So it's that kind of double thinking that I would propose, which is important here, which enables you both to be pragmatic, but utterly critical at the same time, and work out, are you doing damage by that? And there are instances where I think we are doing damage by doing that. So, for example, a lot of scientists have now turned to talking about the nature as ecosystem services. They think that's going to convince people that we can save the planet because we now value the planet financially. In fact, there are a couple of scientists who did a review of the entire planet and put a dollar figure on how valuable this planet is. That's the expansion absurdum of that process. So if you're doing it in a way that is careful and considerate, then the consequences of your naming of the economic consequences of what you're doing will be done with care about who you're trying to convince. And you will not do it as simply a convincing project, because sometimes convincing people that this is economically necessary will actually make it worse. So it's everything, and this is probably the term that I used during my talk, but it's being reflexive about the actions. This is not just reflecting upon what we do, it's reflecting upon how we reflect. This is what Gianfranco was talking about. He was talking about reflecting on what it means to think, and reflecting upon what terms mean, what progress means, what growth means, what these terms and how much they envelop our thinking. And I agree with him wholeheartedly. we have as much a cultural crisis as we have an ecological crisis. And in thinking about it as simply an ecological crisis, we will lose this planet.
Yes.
Over to you.
Thank you, Paul. I agree with every single word of your speech. We are really in the same mood about this kind of problems, and how to live and sharing with our community and our communities. This is a good question, and I think a very interesting concept is pluriverse. And one of the problems we have with globalization is this process that is standardizing and keep the homologation. Everything equal, and really we are completely different. And we have to defend the diversity. We have to protect our diversity, as just in the same way as we are speaking about biodiversity. We have to protect our cultural diversity, because the marvelous thing is to share with Paul, with Emma and Danielle, with people, different cultures, different view and vision of the world, and of course how to live together. It's a big challenge, but I think we have to live, to escape from some paradigms that are paradigms of war. What means competition? Competition means to kill the other. The dream of every company is to kill the competitors. And the Latin, the Romans used to say, "Mors tua, vita mea." If you are dying, I'm living. And this is the base of this word competition. There is another word that is important, and but we don't use. We stopped to use this word. That is concurrence. Concorrere. What means concorrere? Concurrence means, coming from Latin, means to run together. And in the sport, in every sport, we are running together. And of course, there is a winner and there is a loser. But this is the game, and there are some rules, and all the people doing sports is respecting, or probably not all, but anyway, all the people playing soccer or tennis or doing sports are respecting rules, and this is concurrence, running together with some else, and this is very different from competition. About technology is very important, of course, but the problem is the use and the trust. Technology became a sort of religion for in our culture, in our contemporary world. Technology is a tool. Cannot be the scope, cannot be the end of every single action in our research universities, in the governmental policies. European Union is putting the 90% of research funding and resources on technological innovation, and 10% on cultural arts and novel. So there is this disparity: 90% for technological innovation, just to save the corals, as Paul was explaining. That is a big mistake. Of course, we have to adapt, of course, but we have to mitigate. We have to reduce. We have to reduce our impact on and we should use technology to reduce, not to build bigger. I want to do a small sample. During the 80s, there were the automobiles, cars were very small. Even the big one, BMW from Germany or Dodge from the United States, etc. Now, and we did some in the middle of the 80s, beginning of the 90s. We achieved some very interesting technological innovation to reduce the consumption of gasoline in the traditional cars. What happened? We reduced the use of oil? No, the cars started to become bigger. And now if you take one BMW, Mercedes or Ford, and you compare with the same cars of 40 years ago, you can see that the actual cars are the double, 3 times than 40 years ago. And this just because the technological innovation. So we use the technological innovation in the bad way. We didn't save oil thanks to the technological innovation of 30 years ago, 40 years ago, and we started to produce enormous sport utility in vehicles. And now the problem is with the electric car. 60% of electric cars in the world are sport utility vehicles, and this is absurd because we are using very rare and very we know that we have very few minerals to produce our batteries, and we are using to produce enormous car electric, and they are consuming a lot of electricity. Now in Denmark, in Sweden, in Germany, someone is very rich countries, and they invested a lot on electric cars. Now they are understanding that electric cars are consuming too much electricity, and to produce electricity we have to use gas or coal. That is absurd. So the technocracy and technology are very important. In the contrary, we have not the possibility to share this speech with Paul in Melbourne or Sydney, and me in Ferrara, and you in Guadalajara. This is thanks to technology, and so this is a positive aspect of technology. But usually, the big part of technologies in the world are used in a bad way. And the war, the actual war in Ukraine, is a problem of this kind of culture. We are using technology in the worst way, and this is one of our mental slavery. Thank you. Using technology in the worst way, and this is one of our mental slavery. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I apologize again for our technical problems. This has been really an opportunity to think about how we live now, and if we want to learn about our future and what to expect of our future, and hopefully we'll be living together in a better way. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Gianfranco. We're going to continue with our program. We are thanking the people who connected through YouTube, and we'll definitely let you know what our conclusions in this conference were, and we will send you some of the insights and some of the comments and questions that we have for you. Thank you again, and we'll just thank all of the audience. I'm sorry you will not be able to see them, but we have a room full of people, and we'll send you some pictures.
Thanks a lot. It was an honor to be here.
Thank you. Thank you. It was a very nice and interesting an opportunity to meet all of you, Paul. Thank you very much.
Thanks.